Almost $2.9 million to a woman.
In New Mexico, an elderly woman was severely burned
by a cup of coffee
at McDonald's.
That was dangerous and it was burning people.
hot coffee.
Frivolous lawsuit. That is, of course, the McDonald's coffee cup lawsuit.
Welcome to Unshut Cases. I'm your host, Dan Taft. On today's episode, we have with us an incredible personal injury lawyer out of Santa Monica, California, Borna Houman of Borna Houman Law. Borna, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a really awesome episode here because we are discussing a case that I am pretty familiar with from a documentary that I watched. This is the famous hot coffee case.
In Albuquerque, New Mexico, an elderly woman was severely burned when she spilled a cup of McDonald's coffee in her lap.
An 81-year-old woman has been awarded $2.9 million after she sued McDonald's, claiming their coffee was too hot.
Stella Liebeck spilled just 8 ounces of coffee, but she attracted a flood of attention. The jury's award set off a media frenzy and became a rallying cry for those who believed our legal system had run amok.
So on this Unshut Cases episode, we're going to explore Liebeck versus McDonald's restaurants, which was a 1994 case that started in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Stella Liebeck was a 79-year-old woman. She purchased a hot coffee from a McDonald's restaurant, accidentally spilled it on her lap. I believe it was in the drive-thru, suffered third-degree burns in her pelvic region. She was hospitalized for 8 days while undergoing skin grafting, followed by 2 years of medical treatment. And she sought to settle initially with McDonald's for $20,000 to cover her medical expenses. When McDonald's offered only $800, her attorney filed suit in the U.S. District Court for the District of New Mexico, accusing McDonald's of gross negligence. At her trial, her attorneys presented evidence that the coffee they had tested all over the city was served at a temperature at least 20 degrees Fahrenheit lower or colder than McDonald's coffee. Jury found that McDonald's was 80% responsible for the incident and awarded Liebeck $160,000 in compensatory damages to cover medical expenses, $2 million in punitive damages. The trial judge then reduced the punitive damages to 3 times the amount of the compensatory damages, which totaled at $640,000. Decision was appealed by both McDonald's and Liebeck in December of '94. The parties settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. This was a very famous case. Borna, the case became a flashpoint in the debate in the U.S. over tort reform. It was cited by some as an example of frivolous litigation. ABC News called the case the poster child of excessive lawsuits. Ex-attorney Susan Saladoff sees the portrayal in the media as purposeful misrepresentation due to political and corporate influence. When I watched this documentary, the injury was not small. It was a very substantial injury.
Coffee she bought at this McDonald's across the street from the base. It didn't take long for the story to spread across the country and around the world until everyone knew or thought they knew the story.
I mean, it seems frivolous. It seems like it should have been common sense that if you spilt hot coffee on yourself, like that was your own fault.
I think she won her case and won a lot of money.
The summary of that story to me is tying up the court system for a bunch of nonsense.
And I know this was a case that you said, Borna, you guys studied right out the gate in law school. Can you kind of tell me a little bit about how you first learned about this and any kind of insight you can provide?
Yeah, so this is quite literally the first case that we had in tort class. The very first case that we read was this one. And it came as quite a shock because there's essentially it splits people. It's a very divided case. Either you think that the case was a good decision and that she needs to be protected, or, and this is honestly where I fell when I first read it, I thought, well, she has some personal accountability as well, and she has some blame, so maybe she doesn't deserve as much as she got. So it definitely divided the class on both sides.
That's interesting. When you say that she had part of the blame, are you saying because of like the cup itself and how she may have held it in her lap or the actual plastic, or what? How did you sort of see the details of that?
So whenever I first read it, I was just thinking, well, I mean, you spill the coffee, anyone who spills the coffee, and it sounds very, I don't know how to explain it. It just sounds very primitive to say, but you spill the coffee, it's your fault. That's the way I was thinking. Mm-hmm. You spill the coffee, you have some blame. Doesn't mean that she didn't deserve what she got. She got third-degree burns. The injuries were horrible, but I think there's some blame to put there. It was definitely divided class.
What do you think the statement McDonald's original $800 counteroffer was intended to make? I mean, that seems like a lowball offer. I know defendants always kind of do that, but what's your take on that sort of original $800 that they tried to give her?
Quite frankly, they probably just wanted to get rid of it quickly. Just say $800 and hope that she goes away. I think that's probably the most likely scenario.
Yeah, it makes sense. Do you think there was corporate and political influence in this case? Like, as it started to kind of roll out and the days and weeks and months went on with it, McDonald's is obviously an enormous company. They're a global company. They're franchises, I believe, but at the same time, how do you see, them stepping in as this major company and kind of maybe throwing their weight around?
I definitely think there's two parts, corporate and political. I definitely think both were involved. As far as McDonald's being a big corporation, definitely they have some power to shift public opinion.
Right.
Political influence, we talked about the tort reform. So I definitely think that played a big part in the result of this case. So I think both political and corporate influence were a huge factor in the decision, no question.
And have there been similar cases to this one involving, what some may see as a personal accident, as you mentioned, versus like a company liability?
Yes. So one of the other cases that we talked about in law school was the Ford Pinto case.
Out of the 11 Pintos crash tested before its release, 8 of them were found to have ruptured fuel tanks in crashes of at least 25 miles per hour. The 3 Pintos without ruptured fuel tanks were spared due to incredibly cheap but extremely efficient structural alterations, like placing a plastic baffle between the tank and the differential housing, keeping the bolts on the housing from puncturing the tank. To clarify, Ford was 8 for 8 when it came to unaltered Pintos rupturing their fuel tanks in any crash above 25 miles an hour. This was concerning to Ford executives, who quickly ordered the structural alterations before its release.
910. That's the number of quality inspections that are made during the assembly of Ford's new Pinto.
Ha, no, not at all. They released the cars anyway. They skipped the $11 per car fix because, well, nobody wanted to displease the boss.
The Ford Pintos were exploding fuel tanks. And so there was much fatalities, severe injuries from exploding a car. And this raised the question of essentially corporate responsibility. Same way it raised the question about corporate responsibility for McDonald's. Obviously, the two cases are different. But that was a similar case that I remember we read that had analogous arguments.
And how did that one play out? Just so we have something kind of to compare it to the Ford Pinto.
I think it played out similar as far as the results. This was a class action, if I remember correctly, because there was a bunch of Ford Pintos exploding. So I think the results were similar. I don't remember exactly off the top of my head the results, but it was an analogous case is what I remember.
Gotcha. Okay. Do you believe in the perception that frivolous lawsuits are a real issue in this country? I'm sure they happen, obviously, but if they are, what is different about this case? And if it's not such a gigantic issue, why is it talked about as if it is such a, ongoing problem? How common is it, I guess?
So I think, for example, this case got a lot of media publicity.
Right.
And we have a tendency to engage and be very reactive, especially in the media world. Mm-hmm. We have a large reaction to everything. So I think psychologically, when we have one case with such a result, we tend to think to extrapolate that and apply it to every other case and say, oh, there's a bunch of frivolous lawsuits because this one may have been frivolous, but I don't think that's necessarily realistic, so to speak. In this case, there was a legitimate injury and she deserved the result, but there's no question there's frivolous lawsuits. I don't think any honest attorney can argue against that. There's no question.
A lot of the public, when this happened, believed that Stella was driving at the time instead of being parked.
And it worked. In the end, Stella settled for less than $600,000, but that was enough to get McDonald's to lower their temperature and stop burning people. This was an incredibly rare case where a working class victim actually beat a huge team of corporate lawyers and made the world a better place.
Wow, how did I not know about this?
Because those corporate lawyers are really good at their jobs. They spent years running a disinformation campaign to convince Americans that there was an epidemic of frivolous lawsuits, and the media bought it.
Do you think this misinformation had an impact on the public perception that she was driving around with it versus just sitting there in a parked car? How much did that come into play?
I'm sure it had a big, so like I said, even on me, when I first read it, I didn't know we read the full facts of the case, but some of it gets lost in translation. So it definitely shifts a lot of the blame onto Ms. Liebeck, whenever there's that misinformation there. Also, it reinforces the narrative of the lawsuit against the plaintiff. So there's no question that if the public believed that this was the case, then it's just going to change their perception of it. A lot of times this is a common thing with media. I think we can both agree on that.
And what impact has this case had, if any, on product liability and personal injury cases?
First thing is that it heightened the awareness. The media publicity raises awareness towards product liability, which I think is a good thing in certain cases. It makes the manufacturers more responsible. And you can make the counter argument that this is going to just bring more regulations and make life more difficult for corporations. That's an argument made politically. I'm not going to get into that. But I think the impact was definitely a big one from this one. It set a legal precedent on how the courts view consumer safety and product liability. And like you mentioned earlier, the tort reform debates started popping out after this. I wasn't alive to see it, but from what I read, that's what seems to be the case.
Yeah, and I do kind of want to dive into that in a moment. If you had to speculate on the settlement amount, obviously there was an undisclosed settlement amount that happened outside of court during the appeal process. How likely do you think that was, an appropriate amount here? I mean, again, she got $640,000 in compensatory damages and punitive damages initially. What would you, and I know you weren't there, but what kind of value do you think this kind of case should really carry?
I think it's a high value case.
Yeah.
I think certainly considering the severity and the long-term impact on Ms. Liebeck was severe. There's no question about it. As far as the speculation on the undisclosed amount, as you said, the initial jury award was large. The judge decided to reduce the punitive damages by 3. But as far as the undisclosed settlement amount, I think if it reflects the severity of injuries and the impact it had on Ms. Liebeck, for sure, it should be a large amount to compensate for her injuries. No question.
And in terms of like the tort reform itself, can you just sort of speak a little bit to, I know in personal injury, there's something called damage caps, right? I don't know if that came into play in this case, but is there sort of an amount that when someone brings, a tort claim against a company or a defendant or whatever, what is the limitations on in terms of cap? And is that like variable depending on each case?
As far as, so I know in medical malpractice cases, we have the microcap, which was recently increased last year, actually in January. The goal, as far as the caps, it's besides medical malpractice, as far as I know, it's case by case. And there's arguments for and against tort reform. I can give you my opinion. So I can go over what's against it. So essentially, the goal for tort reform, like I said, is to reduce insurance premiums. So you decrease the costs associated with defending against lawsuits. And it also reduces the burden on the judicial system. So that's one of the things we mentioned earlier was the frivolous cases. They would argue that if we have tort reform, we're going to have less frivolous cases. And this is something that needs to be done.
Okay.
The arguments against it is that it limits the plaintiff's ability to receive the compensation for their injuries. Obviously, I'm a plaintiff attorney, so my stake is obviously for plaintiffs, but logically speaking, I think all of us plaintiff attorneys want as much of a settlement as we can get. But going by the law, and my opinion on tort reform is, I think a little bit is okay. I think there has to be some responsibility and accountability, and we don't want frivolous lawsuits, which I do think could be a problem. What I don't want is tort reform to have a negative impact on companies and to raise their costs to a point where they don't want to do business. So I think it has to be a balance.
Yeah, makes sense. I also remember when I watched this documentary, this hot coffee documentary a while back, a lot of it kind of dovetailed into, if I remember correctly, what was kind of like, I guess they were like arbitration clauses or mediation clauses. It seemed to be like some companies had built this into contracts where if there was a dispute where like a tort claim came up, that the person didn't have recourse in terms of like lawsuits. I believe like Halliburton or one of these other like defense contractor companies was actually one of the ones that was brought up in the documentary. Can you speak a little bit to that in terms of like, I don't know if it's a forced arbitration clause or forced mediation. Obviously the person signs the contract, but at the same time, people often, I guess, sign contracts without really fully understanding everything that's in them. And if there is a clause like that, that basically pushes you automatically into arbitration or mediation, does that mean that a person doesn't have recourse to sue an entity in the case where, you know, it's not necessarily a frivolous lawsuit? It could be a very serious lawsuit, but they have no way of actually pursuing that.
So if the arbitration clause is enforceable, then you're going to have to go through arbitration and get the result there before you go through any judicial process, assuming it, of course, the clause is enforceable.
Mm-hmm.
I think that personally, arbitration is a good, if the arbitration clause is enforceable, it's a good thing because the court should honor the contracts. So if somebody does sign the contract, knowing that there's an arbitration clause, of course, we're all signing our rights away when we sign up for accounts in Google, wherever you go. But assuming the person has read it and understands it and they sign it, then the contract should be honored. That's what I think.
Okay. Borna, can you tell our audience where they can find you? Again, you do a lot of incredible personal injury work out here in Los Angeles and Santa Monica. If somebody needs your help on any case, personal injury case, how can they get a hold of you?
Sure. So my website is bornahoumanlaw.com, spelled just like my name is. And you can call me. My number is 888-42-BORNA. You can find me on Instagram. I have the socials as well, YouTube, LinkedIn. So however you want to contact me, it's available.
Awesome. Well, Borna, thank you so much for being here on Unshut Cases. We hope to have you back soon.
Thank you. Thank you.